Do you want to relive the golden days of Stockton? Join Nate Knott on Stockton Alive every first and third Monday at 6 p.m. Tune into thevoiceofstockton.org.
This is Barbara Barrigan-Parrilla with Delta Flows, a radio show by the Voice of Stockton and Restore the Delta. This is the weekly radio show where we discuss everything Delta related: the environment, water management, water quality, farming, history and culture, public events, recreation, Delta food, and the arts. Tune into Delta Flows on KXVS, the Voice of Stockton, streaming live on Facebook and YouTube at KXVS Radio.
KXVS 92.1 coming soon. KXVS.
This program does not reflect the views of KXVS management or KXVS, the Voice of Stockton.
Welcome to KXVS, the Voice of Stockton, and it's time for Delta Flows with your host, Barbara Barrigan-Parrilla.
Thank you, Don. Welcome to Delta Flows. This is the show that is everything about the Sacramento, San Joaquin Delta and the San Francisco Bay Delta estuary. I'm Barbara Barrigan-Parrilla, and today joining me is Dan Bacher. Dan is the editor of Fish Sniffer magazine and an outdoor columnist for the Stockton Record. Today we're going to talk with Dan about fishing in the Delta. Good morning, Dan, and welcome.
Morning, Barbara.
We're glad to have you here today. And, you know, one of the things that we want to talk about first with people is that even though people live in this region, many don't know that the Delta is part of the San Francisco Bay Delta estuary, and that's the largest estuary on the west coast of the Americas. And many people don't know about the significance of the Delta as a fishery. So, starting off, I was hoping you could describe for our listeners, as an on-the-ground expert, what people have fished for in the past in the Delta. How did you end up starting a lifelong fascination with fishing? And what do people fish for in the Delta now?
Well, first of all, my initial introduction to fishing in the Delta was when my dad took me to fish for catfish and striped bass in Miners Slough back when I was 10 years old. And that was just awesome. I caught 3 catfish right away. They fought so hard, I thought they were like salmon. And my dad wasn't much a fisherman, but we figured it out and got some advice from people. And since that time, I've been fishing the Delta and the San Francisco Bay Estuary and a bunch of other places throughout northern and central California. So that, and it was just like I'd been fishing before, like trout fishing in the mountains once, and I also fished off Capitola, but it was that day that was the thing that really got me involved in fishing.
And hooked on fishing for your entire life.
Right.
Okay. So tell me then, what have people, historically fished for in the Delta? You've had a whole lifetime of fishing. And you still have many more years to fish, but and are you seeing a change in the fisheries compared to the past to what people are fishing for now?
Well, pretty much all the species in the Delta, with one exception, people still catch that existed here historically, both the native species and the introduced species. And the main fisheries in the Delta, kind of the iconic one, because you have this annual Rio Vista Striped Bass Derby and Festival, is a striper that came from the East Coast, first with a release of 132 small striped bass in Martinez in 1879, and then in 1882, another 300 were released in Sassoon Bay, and that was, that's one of the most popular fisheries in the Delta, probably with the exception of catfish. More people fish for the striped bass than anything else, but these are the species that anglers target. There's the striped bass, there's sturgeon, white sturgeon. You can't keep the green sturgeon because they're endangered. There's salmon. That's mainly Chinook salmon now, and you can only target fall Chinook salmon. There's also black bass, including largemouth, spotted, and smallmouth bass, but mainly the majority are largemouth and smallmouth bass. There's a number of species of sunfish, including the bluegill, crappie, both black and white crappie, green sunfish, and red-eared sunfish. There's basically 3 varieties of catfish you can target: channel catfish, white catfish, and blue catfish, which are found mainly in the southern San Joaquin River from Mossdale down to near Modesto. And there's other species that anglers catch too, like starry flounder, which spawns in the Sacramento River in the Rio Vista area. So you have a mixture of resident species and migratory fish that you can fish for in the Delta. But the interesting thing is that the one sunfish that was the native fish that was here in the millions before the Delta became, was farmed and you had the levees put in, was the Sacramento perch. That's the only native sunfish that's found on the West Coast and found in California, and was native to the Delta, and that's pretty much gone. I have never seen a picture of anybody catching one, and they were gone by the 20s or 30s. You can find them elsewhere in lakes where they've been planted, like in Crowley Lake in California. But those are the species that anglers target, and so it's you could write a book, or there have been books like Striped Bass that my colleague Cal Kellogg wrote, and I did the introduction for it, just about striped bass on the Delta. That's a whole over 200-page book. So so there's all sorts of opportunities, and they have declined, but there's still, if you want to catch fish, there's still plenty of opportunities.
So that brings me to our next question, which is, can you describe for us what are the state of the fisheries? I want to say maybe over the last 10 years, with a little bit of talk of impact from the drought, and then what are you seeing happening this year?
Well, the striped bass is one of the ones that's been most impacted by the pumping in the Delta, and these fish, they were introduced from the East Coast, but within 10 years there was a commercial fishery that had been established, and that ended in 1935. So they're just a sport fish. And the heyday of the striped bass, the historical highs, were in the 1960s when I was a kid, and there was an estimated 3.5 million. It supported a big industry of party boats and guides throughout the whole San Francisco Bay Delta estuary. And this is caught, you find the striped bass everywhere in all of the San Joaquin River and the Sacramento River system. And they've declined. It's hard to get really accurate statistics, but they declined dramatically after the pumps went in to effect around 1968 and went down to around about 650,000, and then they rebounded during the high water years of the mid-90s, plus a proactive restoration program that was introduced by United Anglers and the California Striped Bass Association.
So can you, Dan, if I could interrupt you for a second, can you explain for our listeners what you mean by the pumps?
The pumps,
yeah.
Those are the federal and state pumping facilities in the South Delta where the water is exported to the corporate agribusiness interests in the southern San Joaquin Valley and also to Southern California.
Okay.
And so they've declined a lot, and the population did rebound also because there was a program that we initiated to salvage the fish or to raise the fish, the striped 1958, and it reached its historical level, its highest ever level recorded back in 1997. So these fish are resilient. If you do the right things and you have the right water conditions, they can rebound. And they went up to 125,000 fish estimated. Well, actually, be between 125,000 and 140,000 by that year. But they've declined in recent years, according to DFG statistics. Although fishermen disagree, but the number now is probably the Fish and Game estimates is about 40,000. Salmon. They're a big species that are targeted on the Delta. People don't know it, but at one time, there was not only 4 species of king salmon, Chinook salmon, that moved through the Delta, the late fall, the fall, the spring run, and the winter run trip, but you also had coho salmon and occasionally pink salmon and sockeye salmon, which are found mostly in Alaska and the Northwest.
I didn't know that, so they actually migrated through the Delta.
Yeah, but the main one, no doubt, was Chinook salmon, and then coho were a substantial part of the commercial fishery. But those fish really need good habitat, and so that's why they declined. You also got and I think that the sturgeon are less subject to being entrapped, being killed in the pumping facilities. They don't record that many sturgeon there. They're somehow able to do it. Of course, there's the salmon, and those are mostly fished for in the Sacramento River. You can't fish them on the San Joaquin because of the low numbers in the San Joaquin itself, except for you can fish below Antioch, from Antioch, because that's around where the Sacramento and the San Joaquin rivers merge. You also got other American shad. They've declined in recent years because of the pumping and because of other impacts like pollution and invasive species. You got black bass, which support a really vibrant economy in the Delta. For a lot of marinas have tournaments. The California Delta, which they refer to it around the country, is a world-class fishery. It produces some of the biggest limits ever caught in tournaments in the world. You also got the catfish, which are a real popular species. And my research turned out that they have not only white and channel catfish in the Delta, but you have big blue catfish up to 80 pounds, but that's mainly found in the San Joaquin River from Mossdale to Modesto. And in fact, the channel catfish record came out of the San Joaquin River in 2008 when Randall Gilgert landed a 53-pound, 8-ounce one.
So
that channel cat.
Okay, so I have a question for you, as you've gone through the species. In science circles, there's always this extended debate between native species and introduced species, and that the only way to save native species is to eliminate introduced species. But fishermen see it really differently. So I guess, Dan, can you explain to me how you would see introduced and native species thriving together again in the Delta? What were those conditions that allowed them all to be together in the past?
Well, what it was is that with the exception of the Sacramento perch, which was absolutely decimated, number one, by the destruction of the habitat that existed in the Delta, pre-European contact. Okay. It was tule marshes, and they live in brackish water too. So they basically are extirpated, but I think it actually added to the ecosystem myself. In the case of the striped bass, is that salmon numbers and striped bass numbers and sturgeon numbers all soared with all three species around. I think there was no real, in the ecosystem of the Delta, there was no comparable fish to the striped bass, and it actually helped reduce predation on some of the by some of the native predators, like the Sacramento pike minnow and other species. So I think I think people, scientists, there's this real, and I think it's kind of obsessive concern with what's a native species and what's a non-native species. Okay, these species, most of them have all been together for 130 years since they were introduced, and there's a different. I mean, that's the ecosystem of the Delta. It's really, and all these species were doing well until the pumps came in, until the massive pumping out of the Delta started. Okay. And so, that's the thing you got to address. Now, there is predation. There's significant predation in certain areas, like fish, around Clifton Court Forebay.
Sure, fish eat fish.
Yeah, and fish eat fish, but, to restore our native salmon, we really got to look up further into the watershed, up to like the minimum Wintu wants to do, which is restore the salmon, the Winter Chinook salmon, above Shasta Dam, and that we got to take proactive measures like that, and reduce predation where it occurs. Okay. But that where it occurs is where there's pumping facilities and where the fish are artificially concentrated.
Okay. So for our listeners joining us, this is Delta Flows on KXVS, the voice of Stockton. I'm Barbara Barrigan-Parrilla, and I'm talking with Delta Fisheries with our special guest, outdoor writer Dan Bacher. So, Dan, talking about, reducing predation, and that the existing pumps is a place where there's heavy predation, striped bass eating other species. Right. But can you talk a little bit? Do you see with the Delta Tunnels project, the intakes as they're proposed? Do you see that as solving a predation problem at all?
Not at all. It's just going to create more. It's just going to distribute the problem from one area to the other, because what you're going to do is, rather than have one or two intakes, you're going to have three. You're going to have 5 intakes. You're going to have the ones in the North Delta that'll channel the water into the Delta tunnels, and then you're going to have the ones that are in the South Delta. Okay. So it's just going to spread. It's going to spread the damage, in my opinion. And nobody's invented a magic fish screen yet that stops killing fish. I mean, I know there's big improvements in the technology of fish screens, but it's really illogical that they're going to somehow restore the Delta by taking more water out of the river in the estuary. It's the most insane idea that I've ever had introduced to me.
Okay, so, and that ties back to what's really needed for adequate, water flows in the Delta. Are you seeing bounce back in the fisheries this year, and how is that tied to some good news about what's happening with the McCullough River fish hatchery?
Well, anytime you get flushing flows, you get a lot more. You get, number one, the fish that the juvenile fish, the juvenile striped bass, salmon, sturgeon, and other species flushed out or to the estuary. So they're, they don't get trapped in the Delta pumps quite as much, and they don't get stranded in back-end sloughs. And it also helps the food chain by nutrients coming into the water, and fish need water, and when you have a lot of water and fresh water coming down, their populations boom. Great. But unfortunately, not always as much as they used to, because the impacts of record years of water pumping from 2003 to 2011 have still had their impact.
Plus, and then exacerbated by the drought that we experienced.
Exactly, by the drought. And there's no doubt that drought has a big impact upon it, too.
Right.
But and you know, there's all sorts of factors. I mean, there's multiple factors, including the invasive species that have been brought in through ballast in the water of boats, big cargo ships.
Okay.
And also the pollution that goes in the Delta, both agricultural and municipal.
Okay. So, but I understand that there's something hopeful happening with steelhead, and you haven't talked a lot about the steelhead fishery.
No, the steelhead fishery, they're not as much fish for in the Delta as other species, but they are caught usually incidentally by people fishing for striped bass with lures for salmon and steelhead.
Okay.
And I went to the McCallum River Fish Hatchery in Clements yesterday, and the McCallum River that to date has received 14,000 adult salmon, which is compared to 4,129 at this point last year, and is on track to break the 2011 historic record of 18,000.
Good.
And they counted a historic number of steelheads so far. It's 350 steelhead that have entered the hatchery. And this isn't even peak steelhead season. You know, they're a winter fish, or a late fall and winter fish. And last year they had a record run of over 600 steelhead.
Can you describe for me what that means, that they enter the estuary? Or they enter the hatchery, I'm sorry.
They enter the hatchery. They go in. Now, you see, not all the steelhead go in the hatchery. There's wild steelhead in the river, plus hatchery steelhead that spawn naturally. But they enter the hatchery, and then they're spawned. The eggs are taken out, and they're fertilized by hatchery staff. They have a big crew there. It took 3 hours salmon spawning. They're not spawning the steelhead yet, but it was great. I mean, it was good to see East Bay Mud and the Department of Fish and Game that have been doing really good work on the McCallum River. I mean, this river for many years was kind of an embarrassment. Back in the 80s, there was fish kills, and now both East Bay Mud and the CDFW are doing the right thing and helping restore the run.
Good. So we have good fishery management happening.
Yes,
at least on one
areas.
river. Yes.
Yeah, in other areas it's not, particularly with the push for the tunnels by the DFG. But there was a whole bunch of reasons why this happened. These fall returns. They managed the cold water and Comanche and Pardee dams to attract the salmon, release pulse flow. They closed the Delta Cross channel gates, and they used tagging data. They did studies to evaluate when would be the best time to release fish from the hatchery. And they also started up a barging program, and they also cited using a specialized diet to assist the fish when they're going from freshwater to seawater. So they're trying some different things, and they sure seem to be working now. So
this is good news for fishers throughout the Delta. Where are some of your favorite places for fishing in the Delta?
It's like there's over 1,000 miles, and there's so many opportunities in the Delta itself. Not to speak of San Francisco Bay and the ocean that adjoin the Delta proper. And some of the best places that I would recommend is for bank fishing. The Sacramento River on the Sacramento County side of the river, from Rio Vista up to Freeport has very good. Always has a bunch of anglers there, and they catch salmon, but mostly striped bass and catfish. For Stockton anglers, one good place that has good bank fishing access is the Bacon Island area and Whiskey Slough. There has been a trend in recent years to post areas no trespassing because of problems that landowners had with garbage and littering and other things. But there is plenty of access, and there's just, there's a whole list of marinas and facilities where you can take out a boat. And so,
do people still fish off of Brannan Island?
Pardon?
People still fishing off of Brannan Island?
Oh yes, Brannan Island is a big area, and it has some of the best fishing. I mean, when people launch out of Brannan Island, they fish right near there, and that was a great place to put a state park. So there's that. Last time I went striped bass fishing in the Delta, we fished out of Brannan Island and went in a boat and caught a bunch of fish in the San Joaquin.
Okay. So there's mixed, and we just want to remind people, if you go out exploring in the Delta, to be respectful of property, stay in those public access areas, and please clean up after yourselves. There aren't people there to pick up and dispose of waste after you're done with your afternoon of or morning of recreation. One of the questions I wanted to touch with you on real briefly is, I know you worked for a long time on restoration projects on the American River. And are there any lessons from that experience that could help with the restoration of Delta fisheries, do you think?
Yeah, I think one of the key things is that we concentrated on just the American River, and we knew that the impacts of the Delta pumping, impacted the steelhead populations, but we didn't put that as one of our demands when we did petitions and protests and had meetings to restore the steelhead run, because we kind of thought it was, we wanted to focus on that. And I think that's a big, important thing for people in the future. When, you can fix a river locally, but when you got pumps that are taking so much water and that are impacting your fishery, you got to take that into consideration too. And I mean, there's no doubt these fish populations, particularly the salmon and the steelhead and the stripers, have declined dramatically in recent years. The resident fish, the black bass fish, and sunfish, catfish, resident populations that aren't as impacted as much by the pumps are doing relatively well.
Okay. There are fishing opportunities coming up this weekend, one in San Joaquin County. Do you want to talk about that a little bit, to get involved youth anglers?
Yes, it's the Oak Grove. It's sponsored by the San Joaquin County Parks and Recreation Department, and I'm just looking up their events calendar right now, and it's going to be tomorrow, 11/16, from 6 a.m. to 12:30. They call it the Trout Belt.
Okay.
And it's open to everybody, but they really focus on kids. There'll be over 2,500 pounds of trout we've planted. Kids 15 years and younger will fish free at the 10-acre park or 10-acre lake.
And they provide fishing gear for families, right?
Yes,
Okay.
Yes, they do. And they'll. Well, here's the number. You can go up the website to San Joaquin County Parks, and the phone number is 209-331-2050, and they will have the information. They say here, I know Fishing in the City has supplied rods, but they say here that at least for this derby, participants must supply their own fishing equipment.
Okay.
So
apparently,
they're not having the rentals. They've had that in other years, I know.
Okay, and you said it's a really well-attended fishing derby. That there were thousands of people there last time?
At least it looked like it. I mean, it was, or hundreds, at least hundreds of people. There was a lot of people. Okay. I mean, it was, it's a real popular event, very well organized.
And so what does that tell us? If it's, you said we were talking before the show, it may be almost too crowded. What does that talk about the popularity of fishing and youthful and getting youth engaged with fishing in the area?
Right, and I'd like to add that the Delta fly fishers, do a great job at that event.
Yes.
They team up with the San Joaquin County to sponsor it.
Yes, yes. So it would seem to us that if we have this big of a demand for fishing activities locally, that hopefully this is something that our local fishing groups and government could step up on. I think for some people who are more urban dwellers of the Delta, they don't recognize some of the benefits or impacts of youth fishing. Besides the fact that it gives people interaction and a healthier respect for nature, it's a really interesting way to get people to engage with their watershed, with their rivers,
exactly,
with their natural areas.
To me, there's a lot. It's a lot better to engage with nature when you're actually there and interacting with it than in an office or in a book you actually, for kids it's very good because they feel in their heart, in their soul, when they become anglers, that this fishery needs to be preserved and it needs to be conserved, and I think that's the great thing about this. Plus, it gets families together. The emphasis on these type of events is on the family.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Dan, as we're closing up here, do you have any other closing comments about what we need to do to protect our Delta fisheries or work or ways for people to engage?
Yeah, I think, number one, support Restore the Delta, all you can to stop the tunnels, and because that is just a really key issue now. And the other thing is I encourage, more people, more groups, fishing groups, like various civic groups, to encourage fishing events, especially to get young people involved.
Yes, agreed. The fisheries are part of our culture, and if people engaged with them more, it would permeate other things, not only the food that we eat on our plate, but our art, our local literature, and other activities. So
yes, it builds community. See, that's real important. In a time when people are isolated and lots of times people don't know their own neighbors, this gets people together and become part of a larger community. Yes,
and the fishermen are and historically have been a wonderful and vibrant community here in Northern California. Dan, I want to thank you. We're going to close up here for joining us today. I want to thank our listeners and Governor Don for his work on Delta Flows. We will be back in 2 weeks with a show on the Delta Lights Parade. We'll be joined by Delta Chamber Director Bill Wells. We'll be explaining where all the events are on the Delta to celebrate the holiday season. We want to wish everyone a peaceful and a happy Thanksgiving.